Okay, here are your Unit 4 judges. And again, congratulations. I've already introduced myself to you. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the judges and let them introduce themselves to you. Of course, please then introduce yourself to the judges, and then the lead judge will read the question and we'll be ready for our 14-minute conversation with you. Good luck.
You're muted, Judge Steele.
I keep forgetting that it mutes me when we move from one room to the other. Sorry. My name is Candida Steele, and I'm retired as a judge on the U.S. Civilian Board of Contract Appeals. And I'm from the state of Maryland. I've been with the program for about 20 years. And Judge Chin.
Thank you. Good morning, Virginia. My name is Gus Chin. I'm a municipal judge from Utah.
Mr. Mott?
I'm Mike Miles from Birmingham, Alabama. It's my job to look after Samuel. I hope y'all took him out to eat last night after you made the top 12. He needed that. He needed to calm his nerves for today. So I hope y'all are looking after him. Thanks.
Good morning.
Very good. Could you tell us who you are, please?
Good morning. We're Unit 4 of Maggie Walker from Virginia. I'm Grace Bouton.
I'm Quinn Smith. I'm Margaret Smith.
I'm Tejas Muthusamy. Our coach is Mr. Olmschneider, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedules to judge us today.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. So I'll read the question. We're going to do number 2 today. And it reads as follows. Members of Congress are not only legislators, but they, quote, are also inquisitorial and should meet frequently to inspect the conduct of the public officers, end quote. How effectively do you believe Congress has used its investigatory power? Explain the differences, if any, between Congress's power to investigate and the power of oversight. Which power, in your opinion, is more significant? How effectively do you believe Congress has used its oversight powers? You may begin.
Congress's oversight and investigatory powers are never explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. Rather, they are inherent powers and essential for Congress to effectively fulfill their duties. Both of these powers use the same tools to accomplish their purpose, but the difference lies in their structure and jurisdiction. The oversight power refers to Congress supervising federal agencies, and if necessary, conducting hearings to assess these agencies, justified through various laws and House rules like the investigatory power, as well as through the McGrane v. Doherty ruling, in which the court upheld that congressional investigations are legal and necessary. The investigative power allows government officials to hold the government accountable through said hearings, used in aid of legislative function, as stated in Kilbourn v. Thompson, which held that the House may compel testimony in investigations. However, these powers are not always starkly different. The 1975 Church Committee shows how these powers can blend together through the Senate's investigations of multiple federal intelligence agencies caused by abuses found through oversight of these agencies.
Congress's use of the investigatory power has become less effective due to hyperpartisanship in the 21st century. To be fair, congressional investigations used to be effective. In 1941, a Senate investigative committee led by then-Senator Harry Truman was successful in exposing profiteering within the war effort. This and other 20th century investigations like the aforementioned Church Committee were effective because they had broad bipartisan support. However, the investigatory power becomes far less effective when it has been used for political gain. For example, after the tragedy in Benghazi, Libya, the House opened not 1, not 2, but 6 investigations into the event. Despite the fact that the first 5 yielded no proof of wrongdoing by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, the Republican-controlled House still opened the House Select Committee on Benghazi in 2014. This had a clear political motive, as then House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy said, quote, "Everyone thought Hillary Clinton was unbeatable, right? Her numbers are dropping." As a result, when investigation had a clear partisan motive, it rarely enables Congress to effectively legislate.
Similar to the investigative power, congressional oversight is less effective when motivated by partisanship rather than a desire to improve agency conduct. Review of federal agencies is inherent to the legislative powers of Congress. At its best, oversight serves as a powerful check on the bureaucracy. However, Congress has underutilized this power under unified government. Throughout the Bush administration, questionable government agency and military actions arose without any substantial congressional oversight. The egregious human rights violations committed by US officials and soldiers in the Abu Ghraib prisons should have been uncovered by consistent and aggressive oversight hearings of all military endeavors. Instead, a Republican majority Congress acquiesced to the agenda of a Republican president. The structures to promote oversight are nothing without Congress members to enforce them. Beyond partisanship, Congress has also backed itself into a corner of inefficiency. For example, 108 different committees and subcommittees oversee just the Department of Homeland Security, preventing effective monitoring because of overlapping jurisdictions. Should Congress want to engage in meaningful oversight, the process is not too complicated to do so.
That being said, the Legislative Reorganization Acts of 1946 and 1970 authorized Congress to exercise continual oversight power through standing committees, which expanded its significance. Congressional oversight is able to prevent abuses made by federal agencies, while investigation reacts to misconduct after the fact. For example, Congress can restrict an agency's budget and jurisdiction, as it did with the EPA in the 1980s. In contrast, investigations respond to crises such as the Watergate scandal. Generally, Congress uses its oversight power more regularly than it does its investigatory power. It might use its investigatory power more effectively if Congresspeople were provided a larger and better trained staff to conduct inquiries. For the House specifically, 2/3 of committee funding is allocated to the majority party, even with the majority as small as 51%. This results in investigatory and oversight committees losing valuable staff members along partisan lines, making this key congressional power difficult to exercise.
Okay, good timing.
On the button.
So, Mr. Miles, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll be glad to. Thanks. Earlier in the day, we've talked a little bit about Congress having to investigate its own members sometimes. The most recent examples were Marjorie Taylor Greene, Mo Brooks, and Matt Gaetz. I don't know, Georgia, Florida, Alabama. I don't know what it is about my part of the country that seems to send people up there that need to be investigated. But sometimes that's on by political standards sometimes. Should there be some ongoing, agreed on set of standards by which a member would be investigated or would not? Or is it just a case by case basis, in part depending on who's in the majority in the House?
Absolutely. So we can look towards the credit mobilier scandal in the 1860s, another example, perhaps a more historical example of congressional officials having to be investigated by Congress. And I think one thing that they did during the credit mobilier investigations that really worked was having a completely bipartisan committee that investigated those abuses and offenses made by those congressional officials. So having perhaps a partisan witch hunt might not be the best solution, but ensuring perhaps equal speaking time or equal amounts of Republicans and Democrats on committees could make sure that people are investigated fairly and with due process.
Sure, and I would agree with my colleague. I think that Congress can utilize its Article 1, Section 5 power to set its own rules. However, I would caution against being too specific because oftentimes that vagueness allows for mobility in Congress and allows to adjust to situations on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you very much. Thanks. A good answer. Thank you.
Could you tell us a little more about the credit mobilier investigation?
Sure, yes, I'd be happy to describe a little bit more about that. So basically, credit mobilier was an example of a scandal that occurred because of deregulation and misregulation of banking by members of Congress. There was bribery and other sorts of perhaps crimes involved in that situation. And the reason why Congress—
So do you think that kind of— Great, I'm sorry, I just want to ask another question. So you think that kind of investigation is an appropriate mechanism for Congress? So should Congress actually be investigating people who may have, senators who may have been involved in insider trading or things like that? Do you think that's appropriate?
Absolutely. I think if we're still using the credit mobilier example, certain senators had taken bribes, and I think this is in direct violation of the oath that they take in Article 6 to fulfill the duties required for this office serving the United States. If you violate the Constitution in that way, of course you should be investigated by Congress.
Isn't that the responsibility of the Ethics Committee now, though, already? I mean, aren't we set up to do that?
Sure, I think it's also a dual mechanism. While the Ethics Committee also within Congress is responsible for that, investigations take a more deep dive into certain events and certain corruption that we see within the government.
Right, and I think that we can look to how the probes turn into investigations. So probing, just seeing if something went wrong, and then investigations actually looking at what happened and who should be prosecuted or get in trouble for what happened.
Great, thank you. Judge Chen?
Thank you. Given what you had mentioned regarding Benghazi, where there was an abundance of investigations, do you think there should be some sort of methodology to penalize what has been an unsubstantiated continuing investigation? If so, what would you suggest?
Sorry, I think absolutely. Again, we know that through the Constitution, the House can set their own rules. So clearly stating what the motive of the investigation is would be a very good way to do this. And putting on restrictions such as cause of action and an expedited schedule for this would be very good. And this is very similar to the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which was on the floor in 2019 and 2020.
I think we do have to be careful, though, because Article 1, Section 6 does state that House members and Senate members cannot be prosecuted for the things they say on the floor of the House or the Senate. And so when we, perhaps wade the difficult waters of ensuring a committee hearing is not too divisive, we have to keep that in mind. But I definitely think, like my colleague said, putting clear set boundaries on perhaps even how long an investigation can last would be a good idea.
Right.
But
And as
even
my
what you had suggested, sorry, wouldn't it be a violation of an oath of office to have a frivolous investigation for purely political purposes?
Well, I think that in Article 1, Section 5, the House, as my colleague said, the House can set their own rules. And since the House is proportional representation and is more subject to the whims of the people of America, it is going to be inherently more partisan and get into that kind of thing more often than, say, the Senate.
Yeah, to sort of echo what my colleague was saying, Article 1, Section 2 and Article 1, Section 3 both regulate that the House is up for re-election every 2 years, Senate every 6. They're much more likely to try and get their moment on C-SPAN and try and use these to a political advantage. So while it may seem frivolous, I think, while it may contribute to that frivolousness, the threat of re-election can also lead to better investigations and more fact-finding missions.
Thank you. Mr. Miles?
Judge Chin has asked a question earlier in the day about the House and Senate's subpoena power when people who are being investigated refuse to cooperate. Another power that Congress has, especially in the House, is the power of the purse. If somebody rejects cooperating, refuses to cooperate in being investigated, or if the House subpoenas them, I'm just focusing on the House now, and nobody comes, should the House cut off their money? Say, if you don't come, if this is the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, we're going to cut off your money when they're regulating the safety of our food? Or is that a disproportionate response to failure to cooperate?
Personally, I don't think that response would be a great response, just because if you're cutting off somebody's funding, that's clearly going to affect somewhere else that needs funding. If you're changing that, it'll affect it a lot. I think a much more effective, albeit it takes a little bit longer, is going to court and filing a suit to enact that subpoena rather than trying to change the budget process and messing it up somewhere else.
I would actually disagree with my colleague. Not only do I think it's Congress's inherent duty almost under Article 1, Section 8, the power of the purse clause, as well as Article 1, Section 9, when it comes to appropriations. I think it's important that those agencies that refuse to comply with the investigation power that Congress has be punished in some way to ensure that they don't do it in the future, because I think the long-term harm of allowing an agency to go unfettered without oversight and without investigation is far beyond perhaps the small changes in budgetary impacts that they might face.
I would definitely agree with my colleague Tejas. I think it's important to remember that criminal contempt lawsuits can take years to be effective or to go into effect. And additionally, the inherent contempt power has not been used since 1934. And in a modern context, it's moreover just a little ridiculous to think of Congress locking someone up in the basement.
Okay. What powers, if any, has Congress ceded to the executive and judicial branches?
I think one of the first powers that we can use, like we just mentioned with the budget, is the budget itself. Starting with President Wilson in the 1920s, we saw Congress by statute cede the power of the budget to the executive branch. And so now the executive branch essentially almost entirely writes the budget for Congress to later pass. And I think that's one key example of this.
Any other thoughts? No? Okay. So you think it's pulled back on its power of the purse?
I think that
What if they disagree with what the executive has recommended? I'm sorry, Grace.
Well, I think you highlight a really forefront issue that's come to Congress is the issue with government shutdowns. When Congress can't agree on whether or not to approve a budget because of incredible hyperpartisanship in the past couple decades. If Congress can't agree to certify a budget, we go into a government shutdown, which is completely detrimental to the entire country itself.
Exactly. Judge Chin?
Thank you. Would a nonpartisan chair of a committee help to address the problem of this hyperpartisanship?
Unfortunately, I don't know necessarily if a nonpartisan chair might exist, but I think a bipartisan commission like we've seen with the 9/11 commission could work.
I think there are other, as I would agree with my colleague and add on, there are other ways that would be much more effective than having a nonpartisan chair. We could look to the Bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee as a great example. They issue bipartisan reports, they hold bipartisan press conferences, and I think that's much more effective and realistic than trying to find somebody who's nonpartisan.
But I think it is important to recognize that it is very hard to get these independent commissions and bipartisan councils passed because it has to be enacted in legislation going through Congress, and that's not able to happen all of the time.
Thank you.
Time.
Great job. Great job.
Very nice job. Wonderful, Virginia. The judges will now give you some feedback.
Great. That was really lovely. Mike, do you want to start?
I'll be glad to. Tejas, I don't know if I agree with the last thing you said. I think that I would be a very nonpartisan balance in the middle. No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't at all. So that wouldn't work. I'm afraid you're right. You know how much I love your school and the work you do. I'm a great admirer of you and of your teacher. One of the things I love about your ability to do this, and you did it again today, Quinn answered my question, and I thought, yeah, you know, that's what I think. That's what I believe. And then Tejas and Margaret immediately talked me out of it. And I thought, well, no, maybe that's not what I think. So, but y'all do that all the time. And I love when you do that. I'm going to try to cut short today and leave Judge Chin and Judge Steele more time. So I'll close with this one. There's an old expression that was used for years, trying to have a nicer house than your neighbors or a nicer car than your friend drove. And it was called keeping up with the Joneses. And I've got to say today, and I will include Natalie in this, I know she works on another unit, but I think Grace and Tejas did a great job of keeping up with the Smiths today. And that wasn't easy to do. It was fun to watch the two Smiths disagree with each other as much as they did. That was a lot of fun. Great job today. Thank you. And Samuel, thank you too, brother. You were great.
Thank you, Judge Chin.
Thank you. Good examples, good responses to our questions. I do like how you approached the, in addressing the question in response to the question itself by starting off this whole notion of inherent powers, providing some case authority, mentioning the church committee, addressing the hyperpartisanships. I trust that you will utilize some of the ideas you've shared with us as you become more civically engaged once you pursue your careers and help to be the change makers for the future of our country. Well done. Good luck to you all.
Yes,
you.
thank